Well, let's return to one of our main stories now. The Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police has told Sky News that she's putting an extra 300 officers on the streets of London from tonight to tackle the recent rise in fatal shootings and stabbings. Well, there have been more than 50 murders in the capital already this year, and many of the victims have been teenagers. Well, Sky's Dermot Murnaghan spoke to the Commissioner, Cressida Dick, who denied London is facing a crisis.
I would not use the word crisis. All I would say is let's focus on the fact that a number of people have tragically lost their lives in the last few days and indeed in the last month. And we need to reduce the number, particularly the number of young people who are dying in street attacks, where often ferocious violence used by other young people in groups, usually, not quite always, associated with street drug dealing. This is a very particular problem which has sort of caused the rate of homicide to rise. That's the problem we need to deal with. The police can't do that alone. We need help from government, local government, other agencies, and most particularly from the public.
Well, joining us now in central London is Leroy Logan, a former superintendent in the Metropolitan Police and former chair of Black Police Association Charitable Trust. And with us here is Peter Kirkman, a former detective chief inspector with the Metropolitan Police. We'll come to you in a few moments' time, Peter, if that's OK. Let's start with you, Leroy. What do you think the answer is to this? Do the police need to come up with a completely different tactic altogether?
I believe they need to move from this overemphasis on enforcement, especially after this wave of 300 extra officers as the task force, because that is a transient response and it's going to alienate certain communities who already have a lack of trust and confidence in police. So I think once this phase of getting back in control and also dealing with all these murder incidents rooms, because I've never known the Met to ask the city police to come to their rescue on helping out on certain investigations. And then I would like to think they'll move from this enforcement approach to a more public health approach. And that's what I've always been emphasising for a number of months now, since I went up to Scotland to speak to the Violence Reduction Unit, because they reduced knife crime by 40%. And basically, it's data analysis with the public health safeguarding agencies, looking at the risk factors, how they prevent those risk factors, and the protection factors to make sure that there's a holistic approach to identify the key people who are creating these violences, and more importantly, get more intelligence back to ensure that the police are a lot more proactive, because at the moment it's just firefighting and reacting to events.
OK, Leroy, thank you. Peter, do you think stop and search is a solution?
Stop and search is part of the solution, certainly, and that's in the short term. There's two timescales we're talking about here. I don't disagree with anything that Leroy said about trying to get into the sources of why people are carrying knives and using knives, but that's a long-term thing, and it's not primarily the police's job. If the police go and tell kids don't carry knives, it's not a good idea, it goes in one ear and out the other.
So what's the answer?
It needs to be all the other agencies, mental health, probation, youth services, schools, colleges, you name it, there's a role for them in this wider approach. But that's a long-term thing. It's not going to stop anyone getting stabbed tomorrow night. That is where the police come in. Leroy was a borough commander, a deputy borough commander in Hackney. He would have had crime problems. And what do we do when we have crime problems? We put high-visibility patrols because it deters offending. We all know that. Everyone knows that. And so, in the short term, we need to get peace on the streets, and that involves police officers.
But they've got 300 extra police going on the streets.
Not extra, moved from somewhere else. So they're not somewhere else tonight, or they're not somewhere else on another day if their rest day's been cancelled. They're just being moved around, and they're getting burnt out, to be honest. They're so overwhelmed with the amount of work.
Well, that might be so, but they have got 300 extra police officers on the street tonight. Leroy, is that going to make a difference?
No, I've already said it's a transient issue, and I understand that they need to be a lot more proactive, but they need to have the buy-in of the community. And that's what I'm talking about, the public health approach. It can have an instant response from now, because even your Safer Schools officers, they are engaging with young people. They might not be as the numbers that used to have, but at least they can start to engage with young people and starting to see them as the centre of the solution, not trying to scare them saying, you know, we're going to do a lot of stop and search and alienating them, because we cannot do this without community assistance. And the intelligence of young people giving us the information is even critical, because, as I said, stop and search is a blunt tool. It is sharpened up by intelligence from the community, in particular young people. So it's not just about firefighting, it's around building a proactivity and, more importantly, getting to the problem solving and prevention piece. Now, those sort of things can be done relatively easily. Get back to community policing and ensure that you get those relationships, because that's what it's all about, making sure people believe you're a police service and not an occupying force, and letting people know, especially young people, that they're not being over-policed and under-protected, but they're being protect and serve for them, and hopefully they will start to work in
Peter,
a lot more cohesive manner.
But you seem to be arguing against yourself a little bit there. You're saying we don't need more police and we don't need police on the streets, and then you're saying we need more community police.
No, you're mishearing me, Peter.
Police,
as usual, no, Peter. That's not what I'm saying at all. I've made it quite clear. We need to have a phased approach. We need to have engagement with young people. Safer schools officers can be working with people. And I'm not just saying it's just police. We have to get youth services involved. We have to get local social services involved to deal with the mental health issues, and make sure the funding goes into these safeguarding agencies, because at the moment we're seeing them being run down. I'm sure, Peter, you'll understand that all these services need to be built back up, but it's not just going to be a short-term impact of reassurance. It's got to be long-term engagement with the communities.
Let's talk about the government, shall we? Because the government have a lot of pressures. They've got to fund the NHS. They've got education pressures. There isn't a bottomless pit of money. So
there is when they need it for something, like bribing the DUP.
Absolutely.
Well, no, there are lots of different issues that the police are dealing with at the moment. Policing has completely changed.
The cost of policing is tiny.
Yes, but they're now dealing with things like extremism, online issues. It has changed to what it was, decades ago, and I suppose lots of the resources now need to go into that area.
These inverted commas extra officers that are going into the knife crime task force, they're actually being taken out of cybercrime and fraud. We're moving the deck chairs on the Titanic all the time. And no matter what Cressida Dick said yesterday, the police service does not have the resources it needs to do all the things that it's expected to do. If she doesn't get any more resources, she's going to have to stop doing something. And every time she stops doing something, someone moans.
OK, Leroy, is this a grass-to-reach issue, do you think?
Sorry, say that again.
Do you think that this is an issue that's at the grassroots? It's not necessarily just the police that need to deal with it, tackle it when it gets later on?
Absolutely. We need to get the grassroots organisations really involved in this, because at the moment they're not getting funded, and that's what the public health approach really does. It works seamlessly with the police and other statutory agencies, all those safeguarding agencies, working with grassroots organisation and sustainable funding. And I know after the local elections they're going to bring in another 45 million into London to support those sort of agencies. And I think it's really important that it's not just crumbs and piecemeal approach. It has to be a sustainable approach, similar to what they did with Scotland. Police Scotland and other safeguarding agencies were funded on a regular basis by the Holyrood government in Scotland. Now let's get this thing done properly, and not just in London but other cities across the country, because we're seeing this similar sort of deprivation, social exclusion, blowing up of violence in deprived communities, and we need to get a grip of it once and for all.
OK, we'll have to leave it there. Leroy Logan, Peter Kirkham, thanks ever so much for your time.